Can't hear.
Yeah, I'm not.
Hey, Rob.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Good to see you again. Hey, Ethan, how are you?
Hey,
I'm
Ethan.
okay. You?
Very good.
Yeah, we can all hear each other.
Yeah.
Can't hear you, Marcus.
Oh, I thought I heard something there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Aha. There he is.
Aha. Gentlemen. Apologies for the technical difficulties. A little bit of a problem today. Make sure that we're live here. I am in Whistler, British Columbia on my laptop computer, and it's not being quite as generous as my home computer. A little bit of technical difficulties, but I can hear you guys now. I just want to make sure the YouTube channel's live, as the other chat room is not really working for me. I may need to get one of you guys to help. It says live. Okay, that's good. That's good.
It says recording as well.
Yeah, I'm recording it onto this computer, so then I can put it onto the podcast afterwards. I just want to make sure that the people that were in the original room are able to see this room now. Oh yeah, there we go. We got people in the chat room. Wonderful. I think we're good.
Hey.
Welcome everybody. Welcome. We got Skunkman Sam in the room, Mr. Robert Connell Clark, Dr. Mark Sheldon, and Dr. Ethan Russo for a little special impromptu gathering to celebrate and remember the life of Raphael Mechoulam. Great Israeli scientist, done some amazing work in our field. And I myself have only met him on a few occasions, but I'm sure some of the folks in the room have some different stories to tell, as well as just people who have studied his work and used his work, like Dr. Mark over the years. And I think we are golden here, gentlemen. So welcome. First of all, thank you all for showing up on a Sunday. Well, I'm sure it's not Sunday morning for all of you, but on a Sunday morning for at least a few of us, right, Dr. Ethan?
Correct. Pacific coasters.
Yes, exactly. How was your trip to Peru, by the way?
Well, it's actually Ecuador.
Ecuador.
Yeah, there was a very nice Can America conference in Quito for a couple of days. And then I spent a week in the rainforest with my daughter, Sarah, and my business partner, Nisha Whiteley, and a friend of hers. So it was great.
Yeah, it looked spectacular. I saw Nisha's photography. So I saw a little bit of the stuff. You guys like staring at giant snakes on the side of on the river banks and stuff. It looked pretty wild.
Right.
Well, we got some folks in the room here linking up with us to hear about Rafi today. Thanks for the idea, by the way, Dr. Mark. I think it's crazy how Hash Church has just turned into like gathering for people that we have lost in the last little while. There's been a lot of that sort of going on. So I guess I'll never forget Skunkman Sam. I think he was probably in his 50s when he told me this, but he said, more of my friends are dying now than I'm making friends. And I was still like in my 30s and thought, well, that's a weird statement. I can't imagine that. But now as I approach 50 at the end of the month here, March 31st, I'll be 50 years old. I have to say, it's very accurate. I seem to be losing more friends than I'm making friends these days. So I guess that's the way life goes sometimes.
Yeah, well, it goes for mentors as well. I don't have a lot left, I'm afraid, at this point.
No, I can imagine. That's, yeah, we all, if you're lucky, you get older. And I say that because my father passed away at a very young age. He was only 55 years old and his wife was only 49 years old. And so I hear people complaining about getting older and they're like, oh, this and that. It's not a walk in the park anymore, but it's like, but you're lucky if you're getting older. So try to remember that out there.
It's better than the alternative, right? If you're not getting older, you're dead.
I mean, I think so personally. I think that there's the random person that doesn't think that, but I like to stay positive and think that, yeah, it's good to stay. It's good to stay on the upside. How are you doing, Rob? It's been so long. How was your birthday?
Nah, I'm doing good. I'm gonna turn 70 in the beginning of May. So yeah.
71
Wow.
last week.
There you go. Yeah, you had one recently. We're all around the same time here. So yeah, spring kids. Yeah, life is
Spring
good.
kids.
I'm in Amsterdam at the moment. I'm here continuing to try to move out of my apartment. It's gonna happen this summer, I suppose. And I'm all packed up pretty much. So.
Dude, that's unbelievable.
Lose my
Your
spot.
apartment.
I moved in here exactly 30 years ago on this coming April 1st.
And who gets the place? I guess everybody
My
wants.
landlord gets it back. I
Oh.
hope he's happy with it. He'll get it and remodel it. It'll never be the ghetto that it is ever again.
Well, lots of good times in that apartment. I'll miss that apartment myself.
Oh, I've had a great bunch of times here for sure. I was shocked when I read my lease a few months ago. I thought I'd lived here for more than 20 years. I said to myself, yeah, I don't know, but to put a number on it, I felt like 22 or 3, something like that. Then I got the lease. I went, holy shit, 29 years. Whew. Time flies when you're having fun. So, yeah.
That is unbelievable. That's just not something that really exists that much in North America, like leasing a place for like 30 years that you live in. I mean,
Yeah.
I leased and rented houses for 20 plus years, and I was lucky if I got like 4 years and I didn't have to move again. You know, we were just
Yeah.
constantly forced into moving, and
Yeah. Well, if
yeah,
I
you
thought
and
I was going
Sam.
to live in any one city for this long, I would have bought an apartment. I feel pretty stupid to have rented it for so long, but I never really thought I was going to stay here. I just never left. I guess there's a difference, but yeah, I didn't consciously hang here really. But anyway, that's how it goes.
Awesome. I don't know what the chat's doing for me right now, but when I punch anything into the chat, no one replies. So it'll be a little bit rough trying to communicate with the folks that are watching right now. It does say that we have a couple hundred people in here watching.
I can see it. You just type test, right?
I think it's just the speed of my computer. I guarantee it's on my side, not anything else. But it's unfortunate because I usually like to pay attention to the chat and engage with the people who are watching. So we can, maybe you'll have to do that, Dr. Mark.
Yeah, sure. I'll relay anything that's prudent.
So I think it was 2014, maybe 2015. I don't know. Maybe Dr. Ethan would remember better than I would. But for me, the one and only real time that I actually spent time with Rafi was at the International Cannabinoid Research event in Leiden, Holland. I went to the one in Leiden, Holland. I can't remember the year. Was it 2018 or 2014? They do it in a different place every year, so it's kind of hard to remember. But that's where I got the photo that I used as the avatar for this particular hash church, and I just approached him and, you know, kind of gave my respects and said it was really cool, the work that he had done, and that had a small conversation with him and managed to get that photo. And so obviously his work was profound in in what we do and everything that we do. So it's I thought it would be a good idea. Well, Mark really thought it would be a good idea to gather and to join all the fellows that are here. I mean, Sam and Rob had Horta Farm for years and years and years, and I'm sure their paths must have crossed with, at least with Rafi's work. I'm sure you probably met him multiple times, and I know you did as well, Dr. Ethan Russo. So maybe we could, you know, tell some stories of how you guys met and some of the interactions that you had over the years, and maybe how his work impacted the work that you guys would have done. I'll try to get this YouTube chat going.
Do you need somebody to lead off?
Yeah, any one of you guys are welcome to lead off. It's super loose, you know?
Okay, I'd be happy to. First, I appreciate this opportunity. I think possibly we should rename this Hash Temple in his memory. I also want
That's awesome.
to plug for Shango Los and I recorded an episode of Shaping Fire on Friday, and it's already posted as of yesterday. So Shaping Fire, if you look for that, we've got about an hour and 20 minutes conversation back and forth, be supplemental to what we do here today. So I knew of Rafi's work for many years before I actually met him. I was already working in the cannabis space for 3 years when I met him. The same time I met Rob and David for the first time in Acapulco in 1999 at the ICRS meeting. So we established a good rapport pretty much immediately. He recognized my name as one that could have been Israeli, and turned out he was born to a Sephardic Jewish family in Sofia, Bulgaria in 1930. My family came from nearby in Macedonia, a town called Monastir, now called Bitola. So there was that. Also, I was getting a certain credibility by being a physician in a space where it was mainly bench scientists and renegades like Rob and Dave. So that was the composition of ICRS then. But we certainly, his work heavily influenced me. Additionally, we worked together quite extensively at GW Pharmaceuticals between 2003 and 2014, when I was senior medical advisor there. He was attending the annual meetings, research meetings, where it was decided what kind of work would be done on the various phytocannabinoids, whether it be THC, CBD. A lot of the work on CBD was initiated there, mostly among European scientists. I tallied it up the other day. We were together at one meeting or another, ICRS or the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicine meetings. He was heavily involved in clinical work. So between those, we were together in 14 countries. And I was really fortunate to be able to share many a meal with him and his wonderful wife, Dahlia. So it was a close relationship. Of course, I have stories. One of my favorites was somewhere around 2008. We were at a meeting in London, and he tried to introduce me to Jörg Gertsch, who I already knew, but he said something along the lines of, this is my friend Ethan Russo, and then he said, he has many crazy ideas. So to me, that was a high compliment, and I've always bragged about it ever since. I was also really pleased in 2005, his last book was released, and he had asked me to write the first chapter of that on cannabis in India. Again, I'll always remember for bragging rights. But I'll let people go around. We can certainly talk about all the scientific developments that he spearheaded or in which he was involved.
Thanks, Ethan. Appreciate that. Just kind of reading the chat here. One question from the chat was, can Ethan explain the distinction for Raphael being credited with discovering or isolating cannabinoids, please?
Sure. Okay, well, this had a real history. Back in the 19th century, chemists around the world were trying to figure out what the active ingredients were in psychoactive plants. So they had great success with the opium poppy. They found morphine somewhere around 1804, also cocaine from coca leaves. But working on cannabis, they were sort of stumped. They could get it down to this red oil. Someone in 1896 isolated what they call cannabinol, but it wasn't pure. Subsequently, Lowe in the United States, after being a refugee from Germany, sort of had the structure of cannabidiol in 1940. But it wasn't until Raphael and his associates, Gaoni and Schwo, 1963, nailed down the three-dimensional structure of cannabidiol. And then, of course, the next year in 64, they isolated and synthesized tetrahydrocannabinol, known to us as THC. But it didn't stop there. That same year, they isolated cannabigerol and had the prescience to note that it seemed to be the parent compound of the other cannabinoids. But that same year, they found the real parents, the cannabinoid acids, CBDA, CBGA, CBNA. And then in 66, they found cannabichromene and went on from there. So, yeah, I mean, people could argue that cannabidiol was discovered by Lowe earlier, but
Roger Adams. Roger Adams was the first one to isolate CBD from Minnesota wild hemp. I think that's who you're referring to, right?
Sure, I'm sorry, that's right. Lowe was working the cannabinoid field. It was Adams, Roger Adams, so I stand corrected there. But it went on from there. I mean, Rafi's work never stopped. After the discovery of the CB1 cannabinoid receptor in 1988 and 90, they isolated anandamide, the first endocannabinoid. That work done with Bill Devane and Lumir Hanoush. And then a few years later, they found 2-arachidonyl glycerol, 2-AG in 1995, and went on from there. So I think that addresses the question.
Yes, thank you. There's always, one person in the chat making sure that the history is accurate. So we got Steve from Potent Ponics, just left, right, and that's not true. It was this guy, it was this guy, it was this guy, it was this guy. I trust that Dr. Ethan Russo knows the history.
Ethan, you would love to know, I mean, how many people who just think that he was the first to discover THC and he was the first to isolate THC, when we all know, and Rafi know too, he referenced all this work very accurately, humbly in his papers, back to the Wood, Spivey, Easterfield isolation that you referenced in 1896, were the first folks to isolate, distilled cannabinoids, the first people to make distillate, I guess you'd say, right? And then it was really Robert Sidney Kahn in 4 back-to-back papers in the early 30s, who really took, so they knew that the thing that was confusing them is that back in the day, this was before spectroscopy and before all this analytical instrumentation, and what they often would do is they would perform chemical reactions on these natural extracts to try to identify the product of these chemical reactions. And sometimes they would be treating with like concentrated nitric acid. In fact, that was one of the derivatives that the Wood Spivey Easterfield group made. In fact, I believe it was Spivey was actually killed in an explosion in the laboratory during some of that work, when they were working with that really explosive nitration chemistry, the same thing that killed one of the people in the DuPont family that was making nitrates for explosives. So this chemistry was often just very harsh and would tear up these molecules. And a lot of times, like when you think of heroin's the acetate, right? And so they would make these derivatives and sometimes be able to purify these chemical derivatives. And so, like, I know there's been a lot of interest in THC acetate these days. This was actually one of the typical derivatizations that they would do when they isolated a compound that had a free OH or a free phenol. And Wood and Spivey and Easterfield carried out enough detective work in their original work to know that there was a free phenol. So that's why they named the compound cannabinol. And you're right, it was a mixture of compounds. But if you look at their boiling points and you plot their boiling points on something called a nomograph, which corrects for the vacuum pressure at which that fraction is collected under vacuum, it corrects it for the boiling point at standard pressure. And often when boiling points were reported, and you know this, Ethan, because some of these are in some of your own papers, it often got reported as this is the boiling point of THC, but they forgot to mention that it was measured under this vacuum pressure. And so the boiling point at atmospheric pressure was much, much higher. But the point is that if you look at the boiling point of what Wood, Spivey, and Easterfield isolated, it is smack on the boiling point of what Rafi isolated several years later. And so that, I think, is the nail in the coffin, that those people did indeed identify or isolate THC. It was probably a mixture of the ring isomers, delta 8, delta 9, who knows, right?
Yeah, now if we're going to quibble about history, we also have to give credit to the Czechs. I mean, speaking to Lumir Hanush, it's apparent that a tremendous amount of work was accomplished earlier in the 50s on these compounds, but it was because of Soviet influence or communist influence. It was published in Czech and was never accessible to people in other countries. But be that as it may, Rafi got the credit. And certainly with these other substances, he was the clear winner, with most of them at least, in isolating them and helping to figure out what they did.
Well, he had proton NMR, which just was invented in the early 60s, that Roger Adams and the previous chemist. So, and I think, Rafi would totally admit that he stood on the shoulders of Adams and Brango and all those people, Kahn and everybody who came before him, because I think there was always ambiguity over the position of the double bond. Ethan, if you look at some of Roger Adams' papers from 1940, you'll see that he represents tetrahydrocannabinol with just the double bond in like either delta 7 or delta 6. It's just in an odd position because they had no clue. I mean, this is during the war, man. I mean, it's amazing that work was even done.
Sure.
And he was the first one that hydrogenated. So he hydrogenated THC that they isolated from conversion of CBD, and he talked about the acid catalyzed conversion of CBD over into THC and hydrogenated it to make HHC, and then patented it, claiming a compound with marijuana-like activity. Which I always thought was interesting. Somebody in the lab must have tried it, right?
Chemistry chuckle. I like that. Appreciate the stories. Lots of people in chat talking about this hydrogenated cannabinoids. Everyone's got lots to say about it.
It's really impactful, like Ethan said, when you lose a mentor, because mentors have this incredible impact on the community because they've mentored scientists who've gone on to be mentors themselves. And so it's like a chemical family connection that you have back to your mentor. And I never met Professor Mechoulam, but we corresponded quite a bit. And by the time I became an active chemist in cannabis chemistry, he wasn't taking any more collaborations, but I think he found great interest in what I was doing and some of the ideas, and counseled me and sent me all kinds of papers. And I think he enjoyed his fame in a certain way, because I think he kind of understood that there were chemists like me and other scientists throughout the world that have now jumped in feet first into cannabinoid science, mostly based on his inspiration and his story. His story is just incredible, right, Ethan? It's just a it's a story about the war. It's a story about, Israel. It's a story about how the NIH told them to go pound salt until the director from NIH went over there and then grabbed a bunch of THC, brought it back to Bethesda, and that's
The world supply. Yeah, I can elaborate on that a bit. So Rafi would tell the story that when he first applied to NIH, as Mark said, they turned him down, and the explanation was, well, nobody uses cannabis in this country, which obviously wasn't true. But the tune changed. Apparently, the son of a senator got busted for, quote, marijuana. And senator was worried that this would make him crazy forever. Suddenly he had funding, and he had funding through NIH for 40 years. And it's true that NIH asked for the total synthesized supply of THC, which was something like 25 grams at that time. And they kept coming back. So it meant more hashish had to be processed. And at that time, this was seized from police supplies. How the hashish got there was interesting too, because it was grown in Lebanon and it'd be thrown over the barbed wire fence. Presumably there was an exchange of money involved, but you know.
I just was in Barcelona, and I met some Lebanese gentlemen, and they gave me the most beautiful piece of red Lebanese hash I've seen in a very, very long time.
Yeah, that looks like what we were seeing in the 70s.
Yeah, it's all traditional cultivars, traditional methodologies. They're younger guys, but they're following, the tradition, and it was just great to. What I really loved about it was, simultaneously there was a woman. We were at HQ in Barcelona, my friend David's club. We were in this sort of upstairs private area that, shout out to Frenchie Cannoli, because the last time I got to spend time with Frenchie and smoke with Frenchie was at HQ in this very spot where I met these Lebanese gentlemen. And so I was there at HQ. It was the end of the event. When I landed at the event, I was a judge for Masters of Rosin, and the Masters of Rosin was a competition with 64 entries and basically half a gram per entry for the judge. So it was 32 grams of live hash rosin that was given to me as I landed at the airport in Barcelona. Half an hour later, I had all this live hash rosin. And so I was giving out the last little jars, little quarter grams, little tenth of grams, just to the people in HQ. And the first group that I approached were these guys from Lebanon. They're actually Armenian and Lebanese. And so they pulled out this Lebanese hash. I said, come on up to this little private area. We'll try smoking some. And there was a girl up there with John Burfello who who works for a company called Flute. FLUTT, I believe. And it's one of these cups that sits on a base and vaporizes the smoke into the cup, and then you drink the vapor. I'd tried a few before and wasn't impressed with them at all, but this unit was unbelievable and how effective it was. Now, this Lebanese hash was very melty. It was, we had a hash kettle that we tried to make a snake out and put it into the hash kettle. But when my buddy lit it, it just was dripping and melting. So it was a very nice caliber of hash. Anyway, this cup was the perfect way. You just put it into the little coil, very much like a Puffco or a Carta or any of these units. And she put the cup on the base and it filled up super psychedelically with this really neat smoky vapor right to the top. and I swigged it down, and I just had to say, like, from taking the moon rides with the live hash rosin, you know, the rocket ship to the moon, every hit you take, I was very impressed with the flavor and the effects of the Lebanese hash. It was just very, very different. I think that a lot of people that are smoking these very pure full melts and live hash rosins would have an appreciation if they could access product like that and be able to smoke it in a very particular way that still made it enjoyable. The high was completely different in every way. It was just, it made me appreciate that traditional hash. And obviously, you know, it was done very well, as you can even just see from the pictures. But
was there a COA on that material?
there was no COA that you know, these were just a couple of dudes that had it, but I'm in touch with them. They've invited me to Lebanon. I've told them that I would love to go there and bring some hash making techniques and maybe learn some traditional hash making techniques. And so I'm going to keep the connection with them. They're very excited and just very gung-ho guys. And I just couldn't believe the caliber of hash that they had from Lebanon. It was shocking, to say the least.
Well, I can step in with a little bit. I first met Dr. Mechoulam in 1993 when I joined at that time it was the International Cannabis Research Society, later changed to the Cannabinoid Research Society. But so I went to the Toronto meeting of the ICRS in 1993, and that's the first one I attended. I believe it was their fourth of 33 meetings that they've had so far yearly. I liked Dr. Mechoulam from the first time we met. His love of cannabis, the cannabinoids, and the endocannabinoid system, and his belief in their importance to medicine, and is something that both of us really shared deeply. He was kind enough to help my cannabis R&D company, the first company licensed in the world to do research and development with cannabis and grow and breed cannabis for medical use. He participated in the filming of a documentary by a Dutch science program, Noorderlight, broadcast on Dutch TV in the mid-90s about the future of medical cannabis. He felt very strongly about it, the cannabinoids and endocannabinoids. And they filmed Rafi walking through my 1-acre greenhouse in Holland, smelling the individual plants and talking to the Northern Light film crew and several other people who were interviewing him on the film. At the time, many people in the government authorities, scientists, and doctors included, really did not believe cannabis had a future in medicine. I knew it did, as Dr. Mechoulam, of course, knew. He visited my home with his wife, Dahlia, and we enjoyed a wonderful dinner with my wife had prepared for us. And I'd like to send my condolences to Dahlia, their 3 children, Roy, Hadass, and Daphne, as well as Dr. Mechoulam had 7 grandchildren, aged between 7 and 24, and I hope they will have a truly wonderful life. And I hope Rafi rests in peace. Rafi truly was the center, like a spider web of cannabinoid researchers worldwide, cannabis, cannabinoid, endocannabinoid. He was endless in his advice and hints, and we helped a little bit. We were able to show that terpenes were able to potentiate and modulate THC and the other cannabinoids. And he was really interested in that. But he was a scientist. I was really a pot grower or cannabis grower, but we reached as far as we could, and I loved Rafi, and I'll miss him greatly.
True.
Very nicely said, Sam. Very nicely said indeed. It's nice to gather with you guys on a Sunday morning afternoon evening in Amsterdam for Rob and Sam. It's been a while. I haven't been doing Hash Church every week by any means, but it's nice that it exists, and it's a place and it's a platform that if we ever do want to gather, if we want to celebrate a lost soldier, or we want to just gather and enjoy the plant that we love so much, it's always here for us. I'll always make it available. And I think it's going on its 9th year for Hash Church. So doesn't that make you feel old? It's crazy how as you get older, you can just gather decades behind you, just decades of like, oh, how many like Rob, I thought I lived here for 20 years. It's like, well, it's been 30. Just the whole extra decade that you sort of missed there, but it happened. Pretty wild. Sorry, I just got my little guy talking in the background here. I'll probably mute it out if someone else wants to go into a story.
Yeah, I'd like to say a couple other things if I could. Rafi was a real international character, and he easily could have gotten mixed up in the politics rather than the science related to cannabis. But in 2002, I had a research project in Morocco. We were looking at how cannabis affected night vision, which it improves. Anyway, I was a little bit concerned there. But I was fascinated to see how Rafi was revered in the science community in Morocco. Everybody asked me about it, and they knew that I knew him, and just constant questions, and the respect was so obvious. Same thing when we met in 1999. I wondered what his relationship was with Mahmoud El-Salih, who, of course, runs the cannabis farm at the University of Mississippi. He was Egyptian by birth, but they've been colleagues forever. As far as I know, politics never entered into their relationship. Additionally, Rafi had Palestinian scientists in his lab. So, we certainly need more of that kind of attitude in the world.
Rafi also I had asked him about Israeli politics. I said, the fundamentalists, gee whiz, they seem to be taking over. This was, I don't know, 10 years ago or even longer. And he said, yeah, well, we need to separate the church from the state. Well, religion from the state. But he says the right wingers in Israel just don't want that to happen. And he privately told me he thought they were all crazy.
Well, I'd apply that to fundamentalists of any stripe.
So I would agree with you.
Are there any hashish fundamentalists out there that insist that you smoke it a very specific way and process it a very specific way?
Yeah, it's the same thing as cannabis growers. Everybody thinks they have the best stuff, don't they?
Right.
Ethan, let me ask a question. So, arguably, I think his most important contribution is the fundamental discovery of the endocannabinoid system and its impact in medicine. And everyone talked about how, this is Nobel worthy and he should win the Nobel Prize in medicine. And when you consider all of the medicines that have been developed that act on the endocannabinoid system that have nothing to do with phytocannabinoids, why do you think that there was politics and the negative stigma of the plant that held up that Nobel Prize, which almost seemed obvious and at some point just seemed laughable that he wasn't going to get it?
I heartily agree. This is a subject of discussion amongst many of us in the cannabinoid scientific community. We didn't discuss it with Rafi per se, but I discussed it with one of the scientists resident in Sweden, and he was going to look into it. The nomination process is a very Byzantine one. It's not something where, I or you or anybody else can just suggest to the committee that this person is deserving. I have to think, but I don't have substantiation on this, that it really had to do with prohibitionist policies in Sweden. Maybe Rob would like to address that further, but I just say I think it's a crying shame that he didn't receive this, and he can't now because they're never awarded posthumously. They did. Someone was nominated and died in the interim, and they gave it to his family. But once you're dead, you don't get it. Rob, do you want to say something more about that? Any insight?
Oh, I just have recent insights on Sweden, but there is very little, if any, cannabis research going on in Sweden. Although Sweden does handsomely grant people to do all kinds of different things. I mean, they have a very good system in that regard, but there's especially on that background, a real paucity of science evidence, and it extends over to the industrial hemp side as well. There are still projects trying to get things together in Sweden, but it's kind of an echo of projects that were tried to be accomplished 20 years ago and longer. That there's not really any new fire there, and the government is well able to help these things should they wish to.
Sure. Yeah, the scientist that I had talked to years ago about the Nobel nomination for Rafi, it's no longer active in the field. Or at least I haven't seen him at meetings in quite a long time. So again, I think you're quite right. He had students at the time that were doing good work, but as usual, they probably found jobs in other areas. And this has been a problem throughout. I can't tell you the number of excellent cannabinoid chemists and scientists of other disciplines who had to find jobs in other fields. Hopefully that's changing now. Certainly, we need a lot of analytical chemists to deal with the output from US, if not other countries.
I think a lot of people have this experience. I mean, Rob, when you were graduating from Indiana University, you had the same problem. Your mentor, excuse me, I forgot the professor's name there. Malberg, yes. He said, "What are you ever going to do with this knowledge? I mean, you can't get a job with cannabis."
He wasn't a guy who just liked to study things like me. Had to be practical, However,
is he still
rest in
alive?
peace. Paul Gordon Malberg did pass away not too long ago, and
Okay.
yeah, and he was just a real straight sort of scientist guy. His one claim to fame that I always really got a kick out of, because it's so different from the rest of his personality, was that he got a hold of some of the limited number of moon rock samples that came back. So around the department, he was known as Moon Rocks Malberg. But that was his real claim to fame in my mind. But
well, Dr. Malberg also had Carl Hillig under him, and that really
after my
kicked
term.
off the classification change.
Mm-hmm. No, good work came out of his lab. A lot of other good stuff too. Good gland morphology work. A lot of really cool stuff. So
he was really nice to me in person when I met him.
He's a good guy. He was nice to me as well.
And all federally funded, right? He had federal funding for this?
He had federal funding for a lot of this. Yeah, absolutely.
Although they didn't have enough
United
money for,
Nations funding considerably as well.
they didn't have enough money for Carl's work, so we gave them a grant, and that enabled Carl to do his work for several years.
Right. No, the UN grants were more involved with trying to have some forensic angle to whatever was being done, like being able to identify glands and things like that. You know, there had to be some little twist that might be able to use to the government's advantage. But he did really good work. His grad students did as well. There's all kinds of great stuff done there.
You were saying that in Sweden, there's hardly any funding for this kind of work. But remember, I forget his name. The guy who wrote the anti-cannabis books from Sweden.
Yeah.
Remember, he was at the ICRS for years, and then he just disappeared.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I'm sure they had those disparate elements as well. But
Did Professor Malberg have an appreciation for the impact of his work? I must have read about, I'm not kidding, about 20 of his papers on the accumulation of cannabinoids in the trichome. This is extremely important seminal work. Did he know the impact that he had on generations of scientists who were going to read his papers and want to continue with research?
I don't know later in life if he finally got it, but at the time, no. But he must have gotten it later in life. I mean, he wasn't just fishing in Minnesota all the time. I mean, he was retired. He fully retired. When he left academia, he really left academia. I saw him at North American Industrial Hemp meetings twice, I believe. And that's the only time I ran into him. And it was really good to see him. But he was trying to get involved after retirement with the hemp side of things as an expert, basically, you know, an expert name.
Yeah, that's where I met him the one time, was one of the hemp meetings in Colorado, and he was extremely nice to me and complimentary of the work that I'd done, which shocked me that he'd seen it. But anyway,
I'm glad that he was that curious still. I never really thought that he was. I mean, he really wanted me to study laticifers. It's just another gland that secretes things, you know. So and I happened to study him as an undergraduate a little bit too. I was misdirected then also. But
another gland that secretes things? Tell me more.
well, laticifers are found in all kinds of things, pine trees to poinsettias, and the main ones, and hence their name, are in rubber trees, and they produce latex, which comes from laticifers. But laticifers make all kinds of pine oils and even terpenes, I would assume, although I'm not sure about that, but I bet they do. And yeah, they're all through pine trees. And euphorbs is what I studied them in undergraduate.
One of the reasons Dr. Malberg was connected with so many famous historical cannabis papers is that he had a license, which meant that students could actually grow cannabis on campus and work with it, whereas there wasn't a lot of choices about that in America.
And when my understanding was, when he retired, that passed, and it just University of Mississippi was the only one left.
Right. At the time I was there were 5 licenses, as I remember. And it was a peak. I think John McPartland even had one of them right at that time. And El Soli, of course, and Malberg. And there were a couple of other ones that didn't really, they weren't part of research departments.
Maryland Weed Control.
Yeah. There you
Weeds.
go.
Yeah.
Yep. The USDA in Bethesda, they had a license. That's right. And then there was one more, I think, but yeah, they were really limited, and only a couple of them were in any kind of an academic setting. So, yeah, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor and Bloomington, I think, were the only 2. I don't think Harvard ever had a license. No, just those two, as far as I know.
So to bring it back to Rafi's work, he got into synthetic cannabinoids at one point. What can any of you speak to that work and what you guys kind of felt like about that? I know some people feel that it's dangerous, but what are what are the advantages of doing dangerous work?
Well, he was a chemist. So one of the things chemists do is take the natural molecule and try to make it better, either longer lasting or more potent. So one of those was HU-210. HU designation meant Hebrew University, where it was working. So HU-210 is a synthetic analog. It's a dimethyl haptyl derivative of THC, which made it far more potent. And so this was used in the lab as something you tried to knock off the receptor in testing other things. I know somebody who took this once and had a really bad weekend, and I mean the whole week.
Was that Bill?
I'm not going to say who it was.
Okay, well, that's why I didn't say his last name.
Yeah, but so this was never designed to be a therapeutic agent. It has appeared in some of the synthetic cannabinoid mixes through the black market. But it was developed as a lab aid. Its three-dimensional mirror image was HU-211, which was non-psychoactive. This was actually, there were attempts to develop this as a drug called dexanabinol by a company called Pharmos in Israel. Unfortunately, after they got the license, they never checked with Rafi again, according to his story. And the way that they gave this was someone would have a head injury and they would give the dexanabinol intravenously, but only one time. So this worked in initial studies, but in the pivotal phase 3 randomized controlled trials, it didn't work. We have to wonder in retrospect whether they had used it more judiciously that it could have worked. Rafi was also involved in study of the CB2 non-psychoactive receptor that affect pain and inflammation. So he had another synthetic agent called HU-308 that was tested. And then more recently, finally, after all these years, there was excitement about the acid cannabinoids, but hindered somewhat by the lack of shelf stability with those molecules. So he made methyl esters of these, and one called HU-580 is a methyl ester of cannabidiolic acid, CBDA, and that could be very interesting in treating nausea and possibly anxiety. It's a prodrug, so when it's administered, it'll break back down into CBDA in the body. So Rafi had his feet in both camps in terms of the synthetic cannabinoids, but also the phytocannabinoids, many of which he discovered or was the first to nail down, to put a fine point on it. But that just gives an idea of the breadth of his work and the length of his relevance in scientific discovery over the course of 6 decades. How often can you say that? A lot of people make an initial discovery and then they're sitting back or gone fishing, whatever it is.
How about you, Dr. Mark? Can you speak to the sort of, the reaction when people hear about synthetic cannabinoids? In the cannabis community, it's generally like, oh my God, that stuff is horrible. It's the spice. It's like there's videos on YouTube, but like speak to the sort of potential reasons that chemists do it, and what why we're that it's not nefarious, that it's not like they're trying to harm people, but there's there's a good behind it where you're trying to learn.
Well, there's a couple factors that influence it. One of it, unfortunately, is the almighty dollar. Financial return on drug development, it takes a lot of money to bring a medicine through FDA sanctioned clinical trials, hundreds of millions of dollars to do that. And so for a pharmaceutical company, it's got to be, the view's got to be worth the climb. And I think, you know, the discovery of the endocannabinoid system impacted drug discovery because people knew how important this system was, because we knew how important the phytocannabinoids were on how they act on it. So I think without exception, all the pharmaceutical companies in the late 80s and early 90s started developing non-phytocannabinoid heterocyclic molecules that look nothing like the phytocannabinoids, and these are most notably the JW compounds. These are indole compounds that look nothing like the phytocannabinoids themselves, but because of the scaffold of the molecule itself, it displays the right functionality in the right way, that it does the lock and key thing inside these cannabinoid receptors, sometimes a whole hell of a lot better than the natural ligands and the phytocannabinoids do. And so the other thing is that a lot of those indoles and a lot of those nitrogen heterocycles don't have the thermal stability for consumption in a vaporization kind of way. So the synthetic spice molecules and all those other synthetic cannabinoids are going to really thermally decompose and degrade into a myriad of different other compounds that are going to have all kinds of bad impact to be pulling into your lungs. So, but I think Ethan's right. You know, the chemist who wants to look at the phytocannabinoids as being the Mother Nature's lead, how can we improve on the activity of these compounds? And, you know, going back to the money thing is, you know, the companies have to be able to patent those medicines, because when they're spending all that money on all those clinical trials, it's kind of the one conversation I'd love to have with Ethan with Rafi was, what was his opinion on running clinical trials on something like CBD, which is a public composition to which GW does not have composition of matter patents on it, and that's usually the top of the pyramid in the pharmaceutical world. You need a patent on the actual compound that they've made, and usually if it starts out as a phytocannabinoid, by the time synthetic chemists are done manipulating functional groups and putting different rings and looking at different structures, they've made a completely new compound, and now they're developing not only the process chemistry to make that compound economically viable, but that's the compound that ultimately they select and bring through clinical trials. When you do that with a public composition like CBD, I think it was maybe the notion that the FDA approval of Epidiolex was going to somehow give GW the ability to have the FDA and the DEA sit down on the rest of the CBD industry saying, no, this is the active ingredient of our FDA approved drug. You can't put it in your tincture or your gummy or your vape pen. But, you know, there's the FD&C Act, which precludes the use of FDA active ingredients in food, feed, or cosmetics. And, you know, the CBD industry now treads lightly on that entire regulation. Ethan, it sounds like you want to say something, so go ahead.
Well, it's a lot we could say. I mean, we could spend the rest of the time talking about this, but yeah, you know how patents work. Initially, they're very broad claims, and then they're whittled down. Ultimately, I think what GW was left with was a use patent for these severe epilepsy syndromes, Dravet, Lennox-Gastaut, and tuberous sclerosis, treatment there. You know, I don't know how much money they're making now, taken over by Jazz, but certainly it's not an exclusive kind of use. And yeah, there is this question now about the viability of the rest of the CBD industry. However, it's extremely extensive, and it would be hard to imagine that they're going to be able to squelch that whole thing. Recently the FDA sort of abdicated responsibility for it at all and kicked it to Congress. Not that there's anyone there that's qualified to make these kind of judgments about complex scientific and medical issues. So it's a pretty sad state of affairs.
There's supposedly a quick fix to this, Ethan, from what I understand. So similar to caffeine, they could make an exception to the FD&C Act, and that's just one signature from the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Just has to write a memo, sign it, and that makes an exception. And I think that's how caffeine could be in Coca-Cola, but it could also be active ingredient in other medicines.
GW did have the world's first high CBD only variety. That gave them a 10-year lead in front of any other cannabis companies because nobody else had it. And I think that was a big help for them to be able to grow basically almost pure CBD, because there's always a little bit of THC in any CBD variety because the CBD synthase makes THC. Also, too, you were talking about, well, listen, I am a natural plant guy. That's me. But we also had a patent for analogs of anandamide because we were trying out anandamide for controlling glaucoma. And we found out it actually did work better than any of the classical cannabinoids. And then we made, from anandamide, we made analogs, and we found ones that even worked better, because the problem with most of the medications are, first, it works really, and that it doesn't keep the eye pressure constant. It keeps it up and down and up and down. And with these analogs that we synthesized, we were able to make it so that there was a glaucoma medicine which truly did have constant lowering of the eye and keeping it constant pressure.
Very cool. How did those guys know that they needed to, like, did you guys sell them? Did Hortifarm sell them on, you need a high CBD cultivar and we can produce it? Or did they come searching for that?
No, when we first met them, I don't know what they were thinking in the back of their brains, but both Rob and I told the folks at GW, Jeffrey Guy and Brian Whittle, who Brian Whittle is dead now, but Jeffrey Guy. So we told them that if you take CBD in equal amounts to THC, it will relieve a lot of the problems that naive users have with, getting too high and getting scared and all that kind of stuff. And they ran with it. Either it was mine and Rob's information or information they gleaned other places. But yeah, so when they came to us, they wanted CBD and they wanted THC.
Yeah.
Well, we had talks with them too, so.
Sure. Jeffrey Guy started as a plant guy. A lot of his initial work, he actually had a patent on traditional Chinese medicine mixture to treat it.
The first plant patent in the UK and maybe Europe.
Yeah. So no, he was a real proponent, at least in the early days of the entourage concept. Then it was ironic that Epidiolex wound up being a 98% pure CBD preparation, which is not what I wanted.
Right. So, Ethan, doesn't that play to kind of like the heart of the issue here, which is that if the cannabis plant teaches us many things, but if it teaches us anything, it teaches us, again, this entourage or ensemble effect, which you just can't replicate in single active ingredient medicine. And
Yeah.
so
Sound
how
like
does,
you've been preaching this gospel for a long time.
I know. So where do we go from here, man? Like
We keep
how can
showing
we
how
find,
it's important. There are plenty of detractors out there. There's a guy who has taken delight in publishing stuff about that the entourage effect isn't proven, or other theories aren't proven. How much proof do you need? There's a tremendous body of literature that's taken place since 1999, when Professor Meshulam and Ben Shabbat suggested that sometimes plants are better medicines than the single compounds. They pointed out that that was theoretical at that time, but 24 years later, it's no longer theoretical. It's proven. We have many examples. At what point do you say, look, we have the examples, so the claim that it doesn't matter it's a done deal. It's already been proven that you have synergy of ingredients in certain situations. So then it becomes a matter of trying to figure out the best combinations. And that's the approach we're taking now at Credo Science, and developing, complex mixtures of cannabinoids and terpenoids from the plant that are going to be fit for purpose, whatever that may be. And it means a different thing in different situations. So that's my spin on the thing.
Well, anybody who's ever smoked cannabis, and if they were to smoke pure THC, 100% pure, and then spike it with a little bit of limonene or myrcene or anything else, then their doubt would disappear.
Yeah, we're trying. We're doing work now with Ryan Vondre at Johns Hopkins to show the entourage, and that is through using pure THC and pure terpenoids in the lab, double blind. So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll have papers showing further proof for these concepts.
It's unreal that we have to prove anything, because think of it this way. You're consuming something. It has no flavor. It has no taste. That's a single methodology of consuming it. Now you're putting these flavors that you can taste and you can smell. And of course, they're going to add to it. That would be like eating food that didn't taste like anything, and suddenly someone gave you food that had wonderful tastes and smells. That's a different experience. I'm so blown away sometimes that people are so unwilling to understand that when you smell something, your olfactory, that is different from seeing, touching, feeling, hearing. That smell, and that's what has probably attracted us to foods and to one another and to just all of these smells that are out in the world. It's amazing that we have to prove
the
it.
limbic system, the sites of emotion, tapping into memory.
Locking in memory, exactly. I've definitely got a few memories from very specific smells, and that is
reminds me of a story. Back when in my neurology days, I saw a patient came back into my office, and there was a smell of Afghan hash. And I'm going, what the hell? I don't have anything here like that. Saw another patient, came back in, again, the Afghan hash. So finally put the nose to work and echolocated it. And what it was a grapefruit that a patient had given me a couple of days before, sitting on my desk. I picked it up, and it had changed over the course of 2 days and smelled very reminiscent of Afghani hash, between the limonene and whatever sesquiterpenoids there were in there. So yeah, and
Newt ketone is the grapefruit terpene, one of them. And it's so interesting, Ethan, because the difference between nucletone and valencine is just a carbonyl group. It's like one oxidation turns a CH2 into a carbonyl group, and you go from valencine oranges to nucletone grapefruit. Ethan, I wanted to share one thing with you, Ethan. So my last correspondence with Professor Mechoulam, I sent him a link to the nose paper. I read the nose paper, and I had talked with Jeremy on Clubhouse before it had come out, and I think he had either sent me an early draft of it, but I read it and I was like, oh man, this is such a cool paper. I was like, yes, this is it. In all of this news of lab shopping and THC inflation, this is what I've needed to read this article, right? So I sent the link to Rafi, and he got back a couple of days later, and he loved the paper. He just
Really?
liked,
Because I
yeah,
didn't have the occasion to talk to him about that.
yeah.
So
I'll
it's
see if I can. I think it was either a LinkedIn message that he sent. He's like, "Oh, this is terrific. Thank you."
if you could forward that, I'd love it.
I will really look for it. I really will.
I believe Valencine is a terpene found in cannabis, correct?
Yes,
It's a
not
sesquiterpene. That's right.
large amounts, but yeah, some of these very trace amounts of sesquiterpenoids make a tremendous difference. And as everyone will attest, it doesn't take a lot. A few molecules would be something that you can sense with your olfactory capabilities, and goodness knows what they're doing pharmacologically to
And right, what I've been looking at recently is pure THCA, and I'm dosing it with thiols. Let me tell you, thiols are maybe 100 or 1,000 times more volatile and stinkier than any terpene I've ever worked with.
EU,
But
right?
I'm very curious.
EU.
but are
I'm
they
very curious.
Which file do you have, Sam?
I'm very curious to see if the thiols do modulate or potentiate THC or any other cannabinoids.
Yeah,
And
that's the issue. Are they psychoactive?
right, exactly. Do they contribute?
So is it the prenyl sulfide that you have? Prenylated sulfides?
Yes, yes, I have a couple of them.
Right.
One of them is the one that the folks that gave it to me, I think I'm afraid I don't remember the name of the lab, but it's the people who published the paper.
Right.
Uh,
Oswald.
yes, and
Ian Oswald.
I'm very curious, and that's what I got this pure THCA for, to mix with the thiols.
Well, that's when you got to invite Nick Ziegler on, because that guy did 20 plus years of thiol work with Yakima Chief hops, and he discovered over 1,400 thiols present in hops, which is unbelievable when you really think about it. How many could there be? And if they're in such small amounts, do we have to think of these profiles? I personally, I try not to say terpenes all the time anymore. I try to say volatile organic compounds. Because when I say terpenes, I feel like I'm leaving out the esters and the thiols and the thiolates and all of these other.
Again, an area that really needs investigation. What are the psychoactive effects of the esters? Because clearly they're really contributing to the fruity aromas that seem to be really preferred by a lot of cannabis consumers.
You know,
yeah, that garlic
well,
smell. Go ahead.
You know very well, Ethan, that before the terpene work that Rob and I and other folks were doing with me, nobody really truly believed that the terpenes were modulating THC or potentiating THC, but we proved it pretty conclusively 20 years ago.
Dude, you proved it in your apartment to random people. What are you talking about? That shit was like, I didn't need to read any papers. I was like, okay.
That's because we didn't publish it. It was for in-house work, really, to be honest. And because I wanted to know.
Well, I loved your passion, because I can still picture myself back in your apartment in early 2000. And I just remember how excited you were sitting on the edge of the couch. Okay, now try it with the myrcene. Like, just so stoked and pumped on the edge of a new discovery. I love it.
When I told Rafi about the terpene work. He was really excited, and I gave him an explanation of everything, how it all worked and everything, and yeah.
Yeah. Well, related to that, people may be interested to know that the Taming THC paper resulted from his 80th birthday, because there was a symposium held in Israel in honor of that, and it gave me the opportunity to publish that in a high-profile journal, British Journal of Pharmacology. So, that was the right opportunity to present that work. So, and to me, it all came from the concept of the entourage. So we have to give credit there in support of that.
What are the stats on that paper, Ethan? I must imagine it's cited thousands of times.
It's been cited quite frequently, and for 4 years, it was the most commonly accessed scientific paper on cannabis. I don't know where it stacks up now, but it was on top for 4 years.
The first place that I released the information about the terpenes being able to modify and potentiate THC was at the ICRS meeting. I don't remember which one it was, but yeah, people
Hungary.
there. What?
Hungary.
Oh, you're right. It was Hungary. I remember. You're right.
Yeah, because I was with you prior to that.
Hey, Sam, you were talking before about a movie that was made with Professor Mechoulam in your grow. Does that movie exist on YouTube, or can we see that movie?
No, not that I know of. I've got a VHS. I've got several VHS copies of it, but I haven't digitalized it or anything. Have you ever seen that, Ethan?
I think you might have shown it to me when I.
Yeah, it was called Northern Light, and it was about Dr. Mechoulam, the cannabis, and the future.
Yeah, it wasn't. I don't think it was subtitled. It was. Yeah. Okay, sure. I think I have vague memories of that. In terms of movies, people might want to look for The Scientist.
So that's great.
Yeah, so that's an hour movie that Zach Klein did, mainly from interviews done in 2012, but a great testament to Professor Mechoulam, his early history, all the stuff we've talked about.
It's hilarious with the little cartoon sketches where he says, well, I went and I had coffee with them. So wherever he went, he had coffee. So he went and smuggled 5 pounds of hash from the police over, but he had coffee with them. So wherever he went, he had coffee. But such an unassuming, humble man, right? I mean, I think there's a lesson for all of us in humanity.
Absolutely. But, he was a scientist and he did have a competitive streak. I'll tell a story in relation to that. So, he and his colleagues had discovered all these endocannabinoid analogs. Some of them were seemingly active, some were inactive. And I must have asked him several times, what about docosahexaenoic acid derivative? So DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, is a component of the cell membranes in our brain. It's also what's in fish oil. And so it's the reason that people take fish oil. And every time I asked, he was evasive and sort of waved me off. I couldn't understand it because he was usually so veiling of his knowledge. We were at some meeting and we're on a bus together, and he whispers to me, you were asking about docosahexaenoic acid derivatives. And he said, we have discovered that they were about 1,200 times more powerful than the phytocannabinoids in osteoblastic function, building up osteoporotic bone. So this is work that he was doing with the late Itai Bob, also in Israel. So, he apparently had been working on this and didn't want to say anything about it until he knew what the real answer was. But to my knowledge, nobody's carried that work forward. So, if people thought, geez, everything's been done, that's never going to be true in this field. It is so deep. There is so much to do. And we've just scratched the surface of what the other phytocannabinoids can do. There are 150 of them. We know the basic pharmacology of about a dozen. And, all the bandwidth's taken up with THC and CBD, whereas CBG is a fantastically therapeutic compound and really hasn't gotten the attention. THCV, again, there's been some work, but goodness knows what we can get out of the other 138 that really haven't had the attention. So with selective breeding and some funding for research, there's a lot of great stuff to come.
Yeah, that was one of the problems, Ethan, in the past. Like before we started breeding for single cannabinoid cannabis varieties, was to get your hands on the material was incredibly expensive and difficult. And that's why we set about breeding varieties that had one single cannabinoid, so that there would be large amounts for research, and so that you could use them as basic colors, like to paint a painting.
Right. Yeah. So mix and match.
I have a question for you, Sam. How does one go about is in breeding, and Rob can chime in on this as well. Is it just standard knowledge that there are breeding techniques to breed, certain things to be produced singularly, or is that something you guys had to sort of discover along the way? Like, how easy is it to just start growing a cannabis plant and only make it produce one cannabinoid?
Well, it's actually fairly difficult. In fact, most people, including plant breeders, cannabis researchers, thought maybe I wouldn't be able to do it. But we were actually incredibly successful. It took 4 or 5 years. So we'd start with a variety that, say, had tiny amounts of THCV. For example, we were using a South African variety, a Afghan variety, a Thai variety, and California orange. And those varieties all had, 1% or less of THCV. So we inbred each of those individually, selfed it, 2, 3, 4 generations, and each time would take the seeds that we produced and find the highest in the target, and kept doing that. And the problem is, after you inbreed cannabis 3, 4 times, I mean, it is the most inbred, it has no vigor. It sometimes it quits dropping pollen. I mean, it just has no resistance. It's because cannabis is a heterozygote plant, and when you breed it to be basically closer to homozygote, it loses all of its resistance to diseases and problems. But what we found out was that we took those 4 populations that we had done that to and combined them, and then the hybrid vigor was restored.
That's crazy. I love the different sides of all of it, from the chemistry that Mechoulam practiced to the collecting of the seeds in hash producing countries, to the actual breeding work, and then earlier we were talking about how it's all about, the profile, the entourage, all of these different sort of profiles. I'm just talking to everybody. That it's this whole that you want. But then I was going to kind of ask Rob about this earlier as well, in the sense that cannabis, produces many different wholes. So we can say we want the whole profile, but we're certainly not using the cellulose and the fiber and the seed, the rich amino acid seed for that cannabinoid, inhalation, medical - recreational experience. So you can take the resin and think that you have the whole, but really cannabis always seems to be about the one from the whole, at least from my experience, that when I'm, if I want to make seed oil or dehulled seeds, that comes from the seed. I don't need the fiber. I don't need the cellulose. I don't need the medicinal components. And so it's just an interesting sort of concept that you can take the one from the whole. If you're making clothing, which Rob has a lot of experience with textiles and the history of cannabis and hemp textiles and the difference, like, do we see, I'm sure you've seen breeding for textiles, even just naturally happening, whether they knew what they were doing or not, versus the same concept that we do for the medicines, which are chemists now trying to figure out ways to produce embryos and seeds that produce better fibers. Kind of just going on, but chime in anytime, Rob. Oh, you're muted.
It's what do people mean by whole? I'll be cynical for a minute, but whole plant extracts are extracts that include more than one class of compounds, let's say. Okay, you've got some terpenes in there, it's a whole plant extract. Okay, whatever. Whole flower extract, whole whatever. I'm just being cynical, but it's overused. It also can mean natural in some ways that people use it. It doesn't mean either of those things.
Rob, what it means is it's got to have every cannabinoid and every terpene. And if it doesn't, it's not whole.
Right. Well, that would be the ultimate definition. But of course, no product, no extract, no even lab ever can do that. Things get lost, especially volatile organic compounds. They go bye-bye real easy. All you have to just sort of think about it and they disappear. So yeah, it's an overused thing. It's back to kind of like the arguments years ago, but again, natural versus organic, until the USDA just co-opted the word organic and decided to rule it. But they don't necessarily, in a world of branding and marketing, they tend to mean things considerably different than their actual definitions. If that helps.
Yes, absolutely. Just replying to some of the people in the chat room here. People are enjoying the conversation. Amazing panel, Marcus. Always appreciate a good panel on a Sunday morning. I get to check out of my hotel in about a half an hour here and drive home. It's a nice couple of days up in Whistler, riding with the family and enjoying life. And
do you have heaps of snow there now? We get so much in California, like more
you
than
guys
ever.
have more. Yeah, you guys got it all, most of it. We have snow, but nothing like Tahoe, and you guys got 50 feet or something.
We got the biggest snowfall in 100 years. And then a week later, before any of it's melted at all, except on the roads, maybe, it snows another 4 feet, and then it snowed again. So it's just yeah.
Well, the water reservoirs in California needed it.
They do. It's true.
Yeah,
they need that snow.
But it's flooding like hell everywhere, and it's just beginning to think about melting.
Yeah, for all those huge glass houses in the middle of the state growing mids, right?
Yeah. Well,
powdery mildew is going to be rampant.
I'm just busting.
They've had hell wet weather everywhere. It's not a good year for. It's not a good winter for growing California. Never is.
I'm busting on Mojave on that statement there, Rob.
Yeah.
So what is your current life like, Rob? What are you working on right now?
I'm just finished sorting through a lot of hemp textiles. I just came back from Turkey, and over the last 10 years, I've built quite a collection of hemp rugs and grain sacks and a few saddlebags, things like that. Practical kind of hemp products, heavy hemp, not fine hemp things. And I have a lot of them stored in a warehouse in Turkey. So I spent 4 days all day long going through those things and trying to figure out what to do with them. Largely, a lot of them we're keeping for collections. Marcus has known about this activity for a long time because I do it with my partner Amir, and Marcus introduced us back in the day. So we had a great time doing this and made some serious decisions about what to do with things. And then I came home and I had shipped a lot of things back to Turkey years ago. I brought things home, a few dozen kilos at a time, sort of, and got things DHL'd and filled up my house. So I had more than 2 tons of hemp things here that were Turkish. So I got them shipped back to Turkey about 5 years ago and put in a warehouse so we could spread them out and deal with them. But I kept some things, of course, as collectors do, and I put them under my bed. So I did the what my lady calls the fucking under the bed hemp, and went through and organized it all, which is cool because I managed to look at everything that built up in Turkey. I bought a lot of things after I'd sent things back, and I'd never cataloged those and still haven't, but I got to look at everything again. So now I have my head around all of it. And the project is to write a book about it. Of course. Gee, what a surprise. So, yeah.
Well, we'll
That's
look
what
forward
we're
to that.
on. Selections and photographs, and I've wrote a bunch of text already over the years for our websites and things. So yeah, the pieces are there. We just got to put it all together.
Well, I want to give a shout out to Amir because you mentioned him. Probably, maybe quite frankly, the kindest human being I've ever met. Very considerate, just very kind, just an awesome all around dude. So if you're watching, Amir, we love you. Shout out to Amir.
Absolutely.
And he loves to smoke.
Oh my God, he's a hashish aficionado of the highest
That
order.
too.
Yeah, I was just talking in private with Ethan in the chat room, saying maybe another 20 minutes. If you guys have anything else you want to mention about Rafi or anything really, just got to get going here after the 2-hour mark and get out of my hotel and get back homeward bound.
Well, if there is an incredible body of work that exists, and a lot of it is open share accessible. I don't know what his final total was, Ethan. I think I must have about 400 papers by I have a
I know
Mechoulam
it's north of 600.
north of
He
600.
was
Okay.
a tremendous collaborator. It wasn't just his lab. One thing about the cannabinoid scientific community is that they're good collaborators. A lot of these papers will have 12 or more people in different institutions. It's like, Rafi does this part, and Roger Pertwee does this part, and Paul Packer does this part. And so, he was a contributor, and it wasn't just the basic science stuff. I should point out he was highly involved in clinical applications. The first paper on cannabidiol for epilepsy wasn't in relation to the work at GW. It was back in 1980, collaborating with the Brazilians, Cunha, Carlini, and that group. And when the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines was formed in 2001, he was there and he was at every meeting and helping to guide people in what was done. So it wasn't a matter of making semi-synthetic analogs that could be patented. He really was into use of the natural cannabis extracts and how they could be harnessed therapeutically. So that was the way he was, a Renaissance man. He had interest in all these different facets.
We also were in contact with the Brazilians, and that influenced our early CBD work because we bred a high CBD variety. At that time, it wasn't as high as the one I eventually licensed at GW, but it was good enough that they were really interested in it in Brazil because they really couldn't afford to get the CBD materials that they needed for their work.
And they wouldn't have been able to grow it in the tropics very well either.
So Ethan, when I asked before, where do we go from here? And you started telling us about all the exciting work you're doing at Credo. How does, how do government and regulatory bodies catch up with where we're already at, which is
Well,
they need a different way of regulating this mechanism? Was
yeah,
that the capitulation that they recently made, is that cannabinoids don't fit in this mono single ingredient medicine, so we need to create a different process for you
I
guys?
really don't know how it's going to shake out. Irrespective of what they or anybody wants, there are always going to be three echelons of activity. Herbal cannabis in its different forms, the supplement industry, hopefully with some measure of quality control, and finally, the pharmaceutical approaches, hopefully with phytocannabinoids. We're trying to focus on all three, more selective breeding, development of rational supplements, and also pharmaceutical approaches. Because anybody who thinks it stops with Sativex and Epidiolex has got another thing coming. There are fewer companies that are working on it, but we're involved with two at this point, Indira Pharmaceuticals out of Vancouver, BC, and Canerta out of the greater Toronto area. And it's not just cannabinoids and terpenoids. The canflavins are of tremendous interest medicinally, and portend to provide really great things in the areas of treating inflammation, cancer, and maybe even neurodegenerative disease. Easy for me to say.
And
The
you think
flavonoids,
that can coexist in frameworks where prohibition is ending and adult use recreational is coming online?
Well,
These kinds of things can coexist.
yeah, they aren't mutually exclusive. There are plenty of people approaching this in their own way. Hopefully it's a big tent in that respect, and we don't get in each other's way too much.
the flavonoids is what we were interested in next after the terpenes. We found that the terpenes could modulate and potentiate the cannabinoids, and we were interested in the flavonoids. And then Dr. Mechoulam told me that if flavonoids are combusted or vaporized, they're deactivated. So they're effective orally, but they're not effective smoking. And I dropped the flavonoids after that because I was really looking for patients that were smoking, because that at the time was the delivery form.
Sure. Again, more to do.
Well,
What do
they're
you
potent
think?
antioxidants, and maybe they have something to do with the overall stability of whole plant preparations, right, Ethan? Where maybe they're not doing something medicinally, but they're doing something chemically on the mixture itself.
Yeah, why not? Yeah, it's a good point. If people think that's not likely, we can give the example of St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum. One of the so-called active ingredients as a treatment for depression is a thing called hyperforin. It's a weird molecule. It's only two-dimensional. It'd be like this in this plane, but on its end, it's like the rings of Saturn. You might not see them if it's at a certain angle. Anyway, hyperforin, when it is isolated, is extremely volatile. It has to be stored under liquid nitrogen, but in an extract of the plant, it's stable. So, there's a good reason that we've had galenicals, tinctures have been popular in medicine for at least 1,000 years. And the reason is it's a good extraction and preservation system. So they ain't going away either.
I'd like to thank Dr. Mechoulam for the gathering place of the ICRS. I mean, that is where all of the modern cannabis science has been announced first, and most of the people doing the work were also members. But incredible world. the ICRS.
Sure. Still going.
Oh, I know. In fact,
In
it's
Toronto this year.
the first meeting I went to was 1993 in Toronto, and the meeting this year is again in Toronto.
Yeah. What goes around comes around.
Fortunately, it's in the summertime when it's nice in Toronto.
But you don't like -40?
No, I live on Lake Champlain, so I get my taste of winter every year.
That's what's up. So where do you guys see, Rafi's work going in the next 25 to 50 years? Who's going to pick up the torch, and where is cannabis chemistry heading? What's our direction?
There is no one thing. It's more like throwing a stone into a lake and the ripples just spread out in a concentric circle in all these different fields. I mean, as far as I could see.
Yeah, no, his legacy is going to be remembered forever as far as this field goes. There's no worry there. And there are plenty of eager young scientists interested in this stuff. My worry is, can they find jobs after graduate school? It's a constant problem. One of the great scientists I met at my first ICRS meeting in 1999 graduated and had to go to work for a tobacco company. A great loss to the field. So
the good thing about that, of course, is most of the big tobacco companies now are diversifying into cannabis. So maybe he what comes around goes around.
Yeah, but maybe not too.
True enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's an old saying, he's not really gone if you remember him and you keep him in your heart. And so I think about that when I think about my most favorite musician, Mr. Jerry Garcia, who passed away a number of years ago. And I listen to Jerry's music every day. And I appreciate Rafi for his body of work. I treasure the correspondence I had with him. And Ethan, I'm now collaborating with Alan Hallett. We're looking at some of these minor isomers that are formed in this Delta 8 manufacturing process, where they're converting CBD into THC, and these isomers are found along the way. So collaborating with Professor Hallett to understand, do they behave like cannabinoids, some of these byproducts? So as you said, Ethan, there's just this whole landscape of opportunity, and we all stand on the shoulders of Roger Adams and of Robert Sidney Kahn and Wood Spivey and Easterfield, those first three guys who are the first people who made distillate. And someday, Marcus, they're going to be talking about standing on your shoulders and going back and watching episodes of Hash Church and listening to us three talk about hash and laugh and look at, the time that we witnessed here, which is the ending of cannabis prohibition. And, there's just an incredible opportunity for gifted people to get into this industry and apply knowledge and creativity. And it's all going to be thanks to people like Professor Mechoulam. So it's just kind of like the whether or not cannabis use is all medical or not, whether you like it or not, it is. Well, whether you like it or not, if you're in cannabis today, you're thanking Professor Mechoulam for all of his work and all of his contributions. Marcus,
Amen.
thank you for having this church too. Thank you.
Temple.
Hash, yeah.
Temple.
Hash.
Yes, let's
I will
change it.
I will be changing the name once it's done. I will go into YouTube, and this will be the first Hash Temple. I think that's great.
Absolutely. That was well done.
Shalom.
Shalom
All right, you
indeed.
guys. Thank you, everybody. It's a super good bunch of people together.
Yeah, thanks for
Excellent.
coming out, guys. Appreciate
Hope
you,
to see you
Rob,
all again
Dr.
soon.
Ethan, Dr. Mark, Skunkman, Sam, and all the people watching. We'll We'll do it again one day.
Bet.
Peace,
All right,
everybody.
guys. Good to see you. Bye.
Good to see you, everybody. Bye-bye.